What is your sense of, I know this is something that Julie as an agent and other agents do often look at particular writing programs, MFA programs, and visit them and check out the writers and read their work. But you told me you have quite a few writers who were connected with the Writers' Workshop that Anna was in.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about that? How did that
That's
come
just
about?
coincidence. One is an author that Andrea signed up, a wonderful young writer named Stuart Nadler. You're at the same time, right? Another is Ted Thompson, who I'm publishing next fall. And Eleanor Catton, was she there? Yeah. So it's just a weird, maybe something was in the water and was planets aligned. I've published lots of people who've been to Iowa, but sort of historically, like Elizabeth McCracken or James Hines, but actually they were there at the same time. It's just an amazing place of, it's so fertile, and it's just so storied in history too, that it's inevitable that you're going to run across people who've attended the program. I only went for the first time last February. I went out because Josh Ferris was reading out there, and I tagged along. It was February. I've just never been as cold in my life. Sidebar, Anna and I are both from the same part of Los Angeles.
That's true.
So, the valley. I'll just say it. One of the hottest places on earth, so Anna really didn't get enough of the heat and had to write more about it.
Sidebar number 2 is that when Reagan came to Iowa, one of my best friends, who was still there, told everyone not to go because she thought that Reagan was the editor of O.J. Simpson's book. And then she felt really bad and she emailed me and she's like, I might have made a terrible mistake, but I think people still went.
I'm just hearing about this now. But it was so interesting to be out there. I have to say, I was a total geek about it. Like Connie, the director, she said, do you want to see Marilyn Robinson's office? She's not here today. It was so great. I mean, it's just a beautiful place, and the whole idea of just being, I think everybody's funded in some way, just paid to go and write and read and think about writing and reading. I think this would get in. I just think it's an amazing opportunity.
You write nonfiction as well. Did you put aside your nonfiction when you were at Iowa?
No, I didn't. I did sort of slow up on doing book reviews, and I ended up finally stopping, but that was only because I started working for Jezebel, and I started working for Jezebel while I was at Iowa, like in the summer between my 2 years, and then I worked there part-time the whole second year. I liked it. I mean, I liked to have the two things going on at once, and Anna Holmes, who was my boss then, was extremely flexible with me on Jezebel, and so it was just super easy to kind of email her at midnight and be like, I want to work tomorrow morning, can I just like work for a few hours? And then she, I could just do it. So it was a nice way to exercise different parts of my brain, and I really liked it.
When we were upstairs in my office, you were talking a little bit about how you approach writing, how you actually physically write fiction differently than the way you write your nonfiction. Can you tell people a little about that? It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, well, so all my nonfiction I just talk directly into my computer using voice recognition, and that works pretty well, though not great. And then for fiction, I always write it longhand, and I try to leave my house to do it, and I'll write in a little notebook. And a weird man in Housing Works recently asked me if it was my diary. No, but that's what I do. And then when that's done, then I go and dictate it into the computer. So all of it gets dictated eventually, and I don't really do very much typing. It's all talking. But only with fiction do I do longhand.
And I know that you do that for physical reasons and also just for tech reasons. But do you also find reading out the book that you're making changes as you're reading in it, that the sound of the words is a key factor?
It's really helpful for that. It's actually great, especially now that I've got a faster version. It's not like super halting. One thing that's funny is that when I do readings like this, I have to really retrain myself not to read the commas and the exclamation points, because you have to read them to the program. So sometimes I slip up and I'll be like blah blah comma and everyone thinks I'm a weirdo.
But so you're actually, as you're dictating it in, you're doing some revising as
Definitely,
well.
yeah. And the longhand is like a little bit rough, so occasionally I'll come across like a passage where I just wrote like 2-syllable word, and then I'll have to think of a 2-syllable word.
That's interesting. Can you talk about, Reagan, about what the percentage of debut novels is that you publish, and it, just offhand, a guess. And then what's different about that experience? I mean, I would think it would be sort of the fun of being an editor, but tell me a little bit about that when you find a writer who's you're going to publish their first book.
It is fun. It's a blank slate. You don't have a track record to deal with. You don't have, people often ask me like, oh, there's this perception or idea that first novels are impossible, and I always say, and I just did a little blog post about the other day, it's not first novels. It's fourth, fifth, sixth novels that are, and I actually know a few writers who've been trying to get together to fund a second novel prize or a fourth novel prize, which I think is a great idea because there is a lot of attention made to debuts. That's one of the opportunities there. You actually, if you get an ad in the New York Times, which is increasingly rare, you get a discount. Did you know that? Like the New York Times book review will give you a discount if you're a first-time, your publisher will get a discount if you're a first-time writer.
Oh, really?
So that's one random fact about it. But the other fact is, yes, we can come out there and say, you can't go to your computer and look at that track record. You can't remember that review that some cranky person wrote 2 years ago for the last book. This is completely new, and that's one thing. And then there's also just the thrill of like, oh, this is something new for all of us.
And what's the dynamic in the publishing house? Do you have to fight harder for a first novel? Do you sign multi-book contracts? Is that happening less now or more, where you'll sign a first novel for 2 books or 1 book? And what is the dynamic of meetings in the way that the house works?
Do you want me to talk a little bit about how we buy books?
Yeah, I would, especially first novels.
Yeah, I don't think there's a real difference. I mean, at Little Brown, and every house is different, but we have a fairly formalized process where an editor reads a manuscript, likes it, gets other people. We're very collaborative. It's a small group of editors. We work together. We read for each other. And if enough editors like something, then we take it to the next step, which is an acquisitions board once a week, where I have to write a memo about the book. I have to do a fact sheet about it, which includes like looking up comparable titles, sales figures. I have to, and basically, you have to kind of plan a defense for the book. And it's on the one hand a complete pain because you have a million other things going on, and often there's an auction, you're in a bit of rush, but it does make you really think hard, like why I want to do this book, how I would publish it, why we should publish it. You kind of have to really be very firm in your ideal, and luckily we've gotten that far. Like, it's easy enough to talk about the book you love. So, and then we circulate that. We do a P&L, profit and loss statement. We predict how many copies we're going to sell, which is always a big guess. But you base it on, those comparable titles, or books that we've done that are similar in audience or tone in the past. And it is always a guess, but it's not a random guess. I mean, you can't be crazy about it, like, this is going to sell like The Help. But you have to be reasonable. And then we circulate that to publicity, sales, marketing. And I know a lot of people say, oh, sales is ruining publishing. People only buy books if sales lets them. But frankly, that's a bit, I'm not out there working alone. The art department is working alone. It's all, we don't ask them what we're going to buy, but we do ask publicity and marketing and sales because they're a big part of the eventual team that will be bringing this book out. And if they're not enthusiastic, we often override them. But we need to know that going in. So we think, okay, we have something we'll have to overcome, and now we know, but we'll do it. I had a book that I was just crazy about, passionate about. I loved it, loved it, loved it. And I brought it to the first sales meeting and gave it my most impassioned pitch. And one of the guys at the end of the table said, I don't really like it. Really took the wind out of my sails. And he was a sales guy, that was important. But then I knew this was an early meeting, and we had lots of time before the book ever published. And so I just thought, okay, now I realize like my pitch is not working. It's not, it's not getting through to the people I need to get through to. So you have time to sort of reposition your ship.
And that brings me to the physical book. Actually, I'm interested in that too, and I think people might be a bit. The cover is beautiful. What was the? And then did you look at different covers?
I didn't. I was really lucky. This was the first one they sent me, and I loved it. I think I gave them some not pointers, but I told them some things I didn't like. I said I don't like drawings, I think. And you had sent me this cover with like an upside down ship, and I was like, oh, I really like that it's upside down and it's on the water, but I don't like that it's drawing. And it looked kind of like Scrimshaw, which is cool, but it looked old, and like the book is in the future, so I was like, and I said, I like green, I think I said, and I sent like some links to covers that I liked, but then Keith
Hayes is
Yeah.
sort of like ace in the hole in the art department. He's just a great, great designer. So it's, they're all great, but when I found out he was on the case, I thought,
yeah, and I mean this was the first thing that I saw, and I loved it. So
Great. But you did run things, you did see some, I mean, you saw some early idea of the ship and things.
well, the ship that was just on the book, a cover of another book that Reagan said that she was really into, and I liked it for that book, but I didn't think that I would like that kind of thing for my work. So it was just kind of like a conversation about like what kinds of things we thought would be good. But that was like an already published, someone else's cover.
we asked the authors just that. Are there things you hate? Are there things you love? Are there things you absolutely do not or do want to see? Because then we can just relay that to the art department and save a couple steps and a couple tears. They don't all go this well.
What else are you reading? What writers are you reading now that are really interesting you? Do you read your contemporaries, or do you read?
Yeah, I read almost exclusively contemporary fiction. Sometimes I feel guilty because I'm like not, I don't know, not living up to my English major or something. But I just really like to read contemporary fiction. So like I just finished Mr. Robb's collection, and then I'm not quite halfway through The Pale King. And which is great and really sad to read. And then I also reread a lot of poetry over and over again. So I just reread everything Anne Carson ever wrote just over and over again. I reread everything Lee Young Lee ever wrote over and over again. I reread Amy Bloom stories a lot because I find them really comforting. Like if I'm sad, I might read those. I read a lot of sort of the kind of borderline fiction that you're talking about, China Miéville, especially The City in the City, which I allowed myself to read after I was finished with this. I had to kind of not read anything that was too sci-fi-y while I was writing it, but I read that. I just adored it, so a lot of things like that too.
Mm-hmm. And do you write poetry as well?
I used to, I don't anymore.
And short stories, will you go back to short stories? Will you continue to do that at all? Or do you have a novel in mind now?
I'm working on another novel. I find it really, really hard to write traditional length short stories. I've done it. I certainly probably will do it again. I have one coming out in Glimmer Train, but I wrote it a long time ago. I like to write really tiny short stories that are 500 words. I find that really easy and interesting. But for some reason, I feel very uncomfortable with like the short story length, and I always feel like I'm screwing up, and I feel like it has to be such a beautiful diamond, and yet there's just enough time to like make a horrible flaw in it. So I tend not to do it as much.
And do you publish many short stories, or do you look mostly at novels?
I have published short stories. Stuart Nadler's first book that we're doing is a story collection. They're very hard. It's a very hard time to publish short stories.
So you're working on a book, and what's next for you, Reagan? What's the next book that you have coming out that you're excited about, other than this one, which I know you're very excited
Anna
about?
North. And Megan Abbott is a wonderful young writer who we have not published before. She was published by Simon Schuster, and her next novel is in July.
Mm-hmm.
George Pelecanos has amazing novels in August.
I think we have some time for questions. If we have some questions from the floor, yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious to know how many titles you publish per year and what is the marketing budget for the new novel?
How many titles do I publish in a year? And a very specific question on the marketing budget. That's on a need-to-know basis. Last year I published 17, and the goal for the imprint is around 20, 25, which is kind of a lot. So it varies. It obviously just depends on what delivers, but around that. And the marketing budget also varies.
Did you want one?
She's not telling.
It really, I couldn't say. It really, it depends on each book.
Other questions? Yeah.
Hi, and I have a question about the imprint, the idea of an imprint within a big publishing house. Can you say a bit about that from the business angle or your own personal experience?
Yeah, is it an why is this so hard? Imprints seem to be more and more popular right now, and I think it's partly in response to the sense on the publisher's side, like as review communities kind of dry up and as identities disappear, maybe a different way to reach readers and critics in other formats now and online and other things is to have a sense of who's behind the book. And it can be either an editor or a genre. You know, we've just launched Mulholland Books, this amazing crime imprint, and that has an obvious sort of rubric, I guess, as crime. For our imprint, it was, and we didn't plan to call it my name. It just sort of worked out that way. But it was just sort of to have a sense of. I guess I want to say a kind of fiction, but it is kind of all over the place. But if I had my way, I mean, we thought of names like Storyville, or it's hard to describe it in a way that didn't, you know. I guess I often had George Pelecanos in my head because I was like, and even for picking up the little logo, like, would George want that? He was a tough invisible critic. But I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah.
This question is for Anna. Why do you feel the need to write fiction by hand?
Oh, I started doing it, I lived in this horrible basement in Iowa City, and there was black ooze that came up from the drains, and there was black mist that would slowly precipitate all over everything, and my stuff was turning black. So I wanted to be out of there as much as possible. But I don't like to use a laptop in a coffee house because I have to speak into it and people think I'm insane. So that's why I started writing in a journal. But then it actually was, it helped things flow a lot better, and I'd also been kind of at a stuck point when I was living in the basement, and getting out into the world really helped. And I like overhearing people, in public places, and it's very easy to just be in a public place with your little book, and feel like you're kind of a part of the world, but also not.